hit the things that the students tend to hit: the flappers, the fashion, the parties, speakeasy, Great Gatsby, of course, everyone wants to bring that up. And perhaps these cultural trends of the 1920s, when we see a lot of cultural and artistic exploration, we see a focus on individual freedoms as people largely abandon the progressive era efforts. A lot of focus on consumer freedom, so buying things in this time of wealth, of growth of wealth as well. Big business is king again in the 1920s. And maybe this decade has a certain poignancy in American history, because we know at the end of all of this, in 1929, is going to come the market crash and the Great Depression. And that's the topic of a lecture that I posted for tomorrow. It's about a half an hour, and you can watch it to get ready for your reflection tomorrow. Let's focus on a couple of elements of the 1920s. I want to talk about prohibition. I want to talk about the new woman and the way that the women's movement has splintered after women get the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. And in the 1920s, we see much more of an exploration of individual freedoms for women rather than that political activism. So we're going to focus on the new woman, we're going to talk about prohibition, and then we're going to head up to Harlem, which is related to prohibition and the new woman, and explore what was unique about the Harlem Renaissance, but especially music and dancing and literature in the 1920s in Harlem. All right, so first and foremost, let's talk about what is it? Prohibition is a constitutional amendment. It's the 18th Amendment, but it doesn't, it's not enacted until 1920. So it's the 18th Amendment. It's enacted in 1920. It lasts for 13 years. And it is the ultimate goal and the successful completion of decades of temperance movements run largely by middle-class women like Frances Willard, who believe that drinking is the thing that's wrong with the country. Now, Frances Willard, she's in Evanston, just outside of Chicago. She's a very middle-class lady, and she created the Women's Christian Temperance Union, one of the, I don't know why I said one of, the strongest temperance movement in the late 19th century. And the temperance movement is filled with anti-immigrant ideas that the Irish, Germans, now Hungarians and Italians, they've somehow brought this drinking culture with them. And the reason that immigrant families are struggling isn't because there's anything wrong with capitalism or the factory system, but it's because they're drinking. Specifically, fathers and husbands are drinking. Now, Frances Willard and the temperance movement, they don't want to look at structural changes. They don't want to look at macroeconomics. They want to focus on individual behavior drinking. Frances Willard has like personal reasons that this makes sense to her. Basically, every male member of Frances Willard's family was an alcoholic. Her father, her brother both died of alcoholism. She had a nephew who was an alcoholic who pretended to be a hobo. He was like a rich dude, but he pretended to be a hobo and he rode the rails and wrote a book about it. Possibly called Tramping on Life. I'm gonna get it for you, hold on. No, I don't have it. I have like 4 other books on hobos over there, but not this guy's book. I think it's called Tramping on Life. But he like took to the rails and was like, I'm a hobo now. And you can imagine his aunt Frances Willard was like, not be a hobo? Can you come home and make something of yourself, please? And he was like, no, I'm free and wild. It's wonderful. And she's like, come home. You're rich. You have money. Stop it. So she has this personal experience with alcoholism that leads her to believe like, this is the thing, this is the problem. But the temperance movement is not about alcoholism. So the temperance movement isn't a movement of let's get care and help for people who are alcoholics. The temperance movement says no one should drink at all, ever. And you can see that there's a difference. There are people that are like, I don't drink, right? I'm an alcoholic, so I don't drink. That's not what the temperance movement is. Temperance movement says no one should ever drink. Drinking is what's wrong with this country, and drinking is what is creating wealth inequality and problems among poor people. Prohibition, they say, is going to make the country more moral, literally sober, but also more sober-minded, better citizens, better workers, better fathers and husbands. This is really focused on men. Better fathers and husbands, and it's going to lift all of those poor people up, and it's going to make everyone more law-abiding. Did any of that work? If you want to put it in chat, maybe chat will appear like magic and come back to us, to me. I'm going to fiddle with that again. It's just driving me nuts. Yes, it came back. Yes, I'm so excited. All right, did it work? Nope. Yeah, Emily says crime increased in this period. Absolutely. There are two periods of high crime in the 20th century. One of them is the 1920s. One of them is the 1990s. And both of them, they're related to each other. Both of them, the 20s is in part because of prohibition and the criminal activity that prohibition creates. In the 90s, it's part of the war on drugs. So both of these, and there's a relationship, of course, to prohibition and the ideas on the war on drugs. But the 1920s, we see an enormous spike in crime. So let's dig into why. Why is there so much crime during prohibition? Here, of course, you see some mobsters that have all been arrested, and they're hiding their faces here. And by the way, Canada and Mexico were like, come here, you can drink, come visit us. When we think about crime in the 20s, we're going to focus a lot on like cities, and that's true, especially when it comes to organized crime like Al Capone's syndicate. Yeah, that's going to be really focused, especially in places like Chicago where the murder rate spikes. But when we think about people being arrested, think about rural areas. This image is from Colorado. Think about Appalachia in the mountains. Rural areas are where the illegal liquor is made. So you're going to see a ton of conflict in rural areas between bootleggers and federal agents. So all of the crime and all of the conflict isn't just in cities. But I want to talk about how prohibition made Americans more criminal, not just crime bosses. So yeah, you can look at the beer wars of Chicago, where people are literally gunned down in the street over who's going to control the black market on alcohol in Chicago. You can look at those federal raids in rural Appalachia to see crime. But let's just talk about people who would have considered themselves. So like, look, Al Capone's going to find some crimes to do no matter what. Al Capone he's not like, oh, if it wasn't for prohibition, he would have become a nun. No, that's not what's happening here. But let's just talk about people who would have considered themselves perfectly law-abiding in 1919. By 1925, they have become what one historian calls a nation of scofflaws. That is, so many Americans consider themselves law-abiding, say, this law is ridiculous, I don't have to follow it. So they become sort of more cynical and untrusting of law as a concept. Like, well, maybe there's some laws you don't have to follow. Americans also in this time period become more aware of corruption. Now, the progressives were all about let's end corruption, especially in urban spaces. But during Prohibition, people are going to become much more aware of the way that some law enforcement officials are involved in the black market, are being paid off by Al Capone. Al Capone was also paying off prosecutors and judges. So people become much more cynical about law enforcement and say, oh, it's all corrupt. So it's eroded Americans' faith in the judicial system, as well as made them more eager to break laws. There's other ways that Prohibition makes people not just more criminal, but more apt to cross barriers and taboos. So imagine a saloon in 1915, that's where men drink, right? You're not, if you're a young woman, any woman, you're not gonna go to the saloon. Like, that's not a respectable thing for a lady to do. But when all bars become illegal, that ironically opens the door for men and women to drink together more than ever. So before Prohibition, men and women did not drink together. That wasn't a thing. Prohibition makes it a thing. Now it's, you're a young woman, you know a young man, and he code word to a speakeasy. Go. It's illegal, it's fun, it's illicit. So it makes everyone feel like they're on the even playing field. This isn't just a space for men now. This is a space for women to enjoy as well. Let's explore that with this person. I almost said character. She's real. Lois Long. She's I'm not going to tell you anything about her. We're just going to watch a little clip about her. And I forgot to pull it up, so give me just a moment to fiddle with it. And we'll get this a watching. And for some reason, this website is very resistant to making this a full screen. So let me just try and make it a little bit bigger for you. Make sure we've got our closed captioning on, get some volume, and let's talk about men and women at speakeasies and how they're gonna get up to all kinds of stuff that they might not have gotten up to before. This is an excellent documentary that's not on Netflix or Amazon right now, but if you ever get a chance to watch it, it's called Prohibition. It's a fun documentary. One of the best parts is all of these old people who reminisce about the 20s. And one very, very old man, oh, it kills me. He says, what happened? He's very old. So imagine he's a very old man. What happened in the 1920s, you see, is that men discovered the clitoris. So this is also a time of sexual revolution. And it's part of like, well, we're already out. We're already breaking the law. What else can we do? All right.
My girlish delight in bar rooms received a serious setback a week or so ago in a place which shall, not to say should, be nameless. The cause was a good old-fashioned raid. It wasn't one of those refined, modern things where gentlemen in evening dress arise suavely from ringside tables and depart, arm in arm, towards the waiting patrol wagons. It was one of those movie affairs where burly cops kick down the doors and women fall fainting on tables and strong men crawl under them and waiters shriek and start throwing bottles out of windows. Lois Long, The New Yorker.
When the New Yorker magazine began weekly publication in 1925, its advertising prospectus vowed that it would be witty and sophisticated, and definitely not for what it called the old lady in Dubuque. 23-year-old Lois Long, the Vassar-educated daughter of a congregational minister, was assigned to cover the city's nightlife. Her pen name was Lipstick.
To the accompaniment of a slight shiver of outworn padlocks, Barney Gallant is doing business at the old stand. The place is dimly lit, comfortable, and decorated in modernistic bohemian fashion. The review is as bad as ever. I don't like to put any deserving black-bottom dancers out of a job, but I don't see why Barney bothers with entertainment at all. In a place as dark as that, people ought to be able to entertain themselves.
Lois Long's columns were laced with a wicked sort of sexual sense of humor. She openly flouted sexual and social conventions. She was a favorite of Harold Ross, who was the original editor of The New Yorker and who couldn't have been more different from Long if he had tried. He was a staid and proper Midwesterner, and she was absolutely a wild woman. She would come into the office at 4 in the morning, usually inebriated, still in an evening dress, and she would, having forgotten the key to her cubicle, she would normally prop herself up on a chair and try to, in stocking feet, jump over the cubicle, usually in a dress that was too immodest for Harold Ross's liking. She was, in every sense of the word, both in public and private, the embodiment of the 1920s flapper, and her readers really loved her.
Yes, sir, that's my baby. No, sir, don't be baby. Yes.
Texas Guinan, who is now carousing at the Salon Royale, has added to her show a girl who does a hooch dance with the aid of a real boa constrictor, a good 8 feet long. Since Texas's place is legitimately open until 7 a.m. or later, and is therefore the last stop on the nightclub world, You can imagine the effect of this on late arrivals, who are a little the worse for wear. The highlight of the week was the opening of the Club Mirador. I have never seen so many good-looking blonde women in my life as were present. The men were not handsome, but they looked like good providers. Rosita and Ramon are dancing at the Mirador and look so suspiciously Spanish that I am convinced they were born in Jersey City.
Most women who were working didn't make enough money to go to nightclubs to spend their evenings drinking and dancing in the arms of dashing young men. That simply wasn't available to most people. This is still a country in which there are deep inequities. But they could read about what it was like to be a young, single, liberated woman who goes to all the right nightclubs, who drinks all of the right liquors, who knows all of the right people.
Another thing that your most high-hat friends have recently discovered is the Cotton Club in Harlem. I cannot believe that most of them realize that they are listening to probably the greatest jazz orchestra of all time, which is Duke Ellington's. I'll fight anyone who says different. It is barbaric and rhythmic and brassy as jazz ought to be. And it is all too much for an impressionable girl.
Harlem had hundreds of speakeasies of its own, most hidden behind storefronts and tucked away in alleys. The Spider's Web and the Nest, the Garden of Joy and the Bucket of Blood, the Shim Sham and the Hacha and the Yeah Man, Connie's Inn and the Patagonia Club and Small's Paradise. Some, like the Cotton Club, allowed only white customers, but most were black and tans, eager to sell drinks to customers of both races.
Above 125th Street, the latest place visited was the Club Harlem. Your first impression is of very pleasing decoration. The second impression is of a grand blues orchestra. And the third is probably the most inferior collection of white people you can see anywhere. Possibly they are hired by the management to give the colored people magnificent dignity by contrast. But I don't know.
We used to go dancing up there, and the music, of course, was wonderful. It was a time when quite a lot of white people were up there. They were sort of interested to have us, and we were all ashamed to dance because they all danced so much better than we did.
What occasions the focusing of attention on the Negro? Granted that white people have long enjoyed the Negro entertainment as a diversion. Is it not something different, something more when they bodily throw themselves into Negro entertainment in cabarets? They camel and fishtail and turkey. They geechee and black bottom and scrunch. Maybe these Nordics at last have tuned in our wavelength. Maybe they are at last learning to speak our language. Rudolph Fisher.
I have tried, and I have not, and students have tried too. We cannot find the scrunch. I believe the scrunch as a dance is lost to us. I cannot tell you how to do the scrunch, but if you can find it and perform it, I will give you extra credit. I offer that every semester. No one has yet discovered it, so maybe it'll be you. Let's go back to, oh, we're all the way back here again. Yeah, let's resume slideshow. Thank you. All right, and I am still sharing, but I'm not. Sorry. There we go. All right, awesome. What that video and this little clip is exploring with us is that the way that prohibition not just made people scoff laws, but encouraged people to cross barriers that they normally wouldn't have crossed. Now, you can argue that white women like Margot Wilkie, the old lady who was talking to us there, are tourists in Harlem. Like they might not get it. They don't really embrace necessarily rights for African Americans. They might just be tourists, right? Just going there to hear good music and to dance and then go back home to Midtown Manhattan. But nonetheless, this creates new spaces, new interracial spaces that were really not common, even in the North, which wasn't under Jim Crow segregation, but was segregated by custom. So Harlem, New York, is a highly segregated city. So white and Black people drinking together at these Black and Tans in Harlem was something to pay attention to. Now, like the clip said too, not everyone could afford this luxurious, high-flying life. But you don't need to be in New York, Chicago, or LA to go to a speakeasy. If you're in the rural Kansas, you know whose home to go to, who has has some drinks in the back room. All over the country, you knew where to go. And if you looked at people going in and out of the Cotton Club with its big, bright, beautiful lights, this wasn't hidden. Everyone knew what was going on at speakeasies. They were in the magazines, they were in films. This was really not hidden. And this, again, made people more cynical because they knew that police officers, prosecutors, judges, city officials were being paid off to let these clubs flourish. So this open corruption of the 1920s really did make people more cynical. I want to head back to Harlem and talk a little bit more about more of these barriers that are being crossed in Prohibition. And I'm going to actually play another video for you because they sum up like my whole lecture in 5 minutes. I don't know how. And what we're going to be exploring is the increased visibility in this time period of queer spaces as well. So gay and lesbian bars, what we would call gay and lesbian bars today, they might have been called pansy bars or other names in the 1920s. They had existed, especially in cities, for decades. And they weren't terribly hidden, but they were illegal. And so they were frequently raided by police. That really set them apart from other saloons. But in the 1920s, when all drinking establishments are equally illegal, all of a sudden those gay and lesbian bars become on equal footing with other bars. So they become much more accessible. And another element of this tourism that we see is that people that we wouldn't call gay or lesbian, people that we would call straight are going to these bars just because they're interested in seeing what's going on. So they're merging in Harlem. So Harlem is, of course, the epicenter of music and dancing in the 1920s, but it's also where you're going to find a lot of these interesting queer spaces. So let's talk about Gladys Bentley, featured here. I found this video from PBS that is so delightful. They do a really good job. We're just going to watch the first 5 minutes. You can watch the rest if you're interested. Her life gets very complicated after the 1920s. So if you're interested, you can watch more about Gladys Bentley. We were listening to her music as you came in, and you may have heard some of those lines like, I must have been out with women because I don't like no men. The gal I went out with was gone. Like, it's not hidden. You could buy a record that had absolutely obvious lesbian lyrics. Like, none of this was hidden away in the 1920s the way that we might imagine. So let's learn a little bit more about Gladys Bentley, and then we'll move on. Sure, I got
Gladys Bentley was an incredible talent on the piano and one of the few women at this time who was really boldly out and unashamed of her queer desires.
They say I don't act right, it's only like how I wanna live my life.
You're the Gladys Bentley. I thought your name sounded vaguely familiar.
1958, Los Angeles, California.
Well, what are you going to sing, Gladys?
I'm going to try to do Them There Eyes.
Them There Eyes.
Blues singer and pianist Gladys Bentley made her only television appearance on Groucho Marx's You Bet Your Life comedy show.
I loved you the first time I looked into them there eyes. Got a cute little way of flirting with them there eyes.
Gladys Bentley, the way that she presented herself was usually in a tux and a top hat, but she also had the makeup. She's always playing with identity and presentation and fluidity.
I have violated the accepted code of morals, but the world applauded my piano playing and song styling. Even though people bitterly condemned my personal way of living, they still could appreciate my artistry as a performer.
Yes, baby. Them
Gladys Bentley was born in 1907 to a working-class family in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Her father was African American, her mother an immigrant from Trinidad.
It seems I was born different. At the age of 9, I stole my brother's suits and began to feel more comfortable in boys' clothes than in dresses.
Early on, she knew that she was attracted to women. She didn't feel like her body represented who she was.
Her parents are concerned about her budding lesbianism. They take her to doctors hoping to cure her, to make her a quote-unquote normal woman. We have the rise of medical experts who study the science of sex, who are introducing terms like homosexual and heterosexual. But most doctors at this time saw same-sex desire as pathological.
Some decide to take the reins of their destiny in their own hands. That is the way I reacted to being an unwanted child.
In 1923, at age 16, with dreams of becoming a musician, Bentley ran away from home to live in Harlem, New York, then the epicenter of the Harlem Renaissance.
It was a flowering time of African American arts, letters, cultural expression. When African Americans left the South with the Great Migration, they really create lives for themselves in places like New York, Chicago, Detroit, building these urban communities that were tolerant, that supported experimentation and different kinds of identities.
One of the reasons Harlem emerges as such a central site for queer African Americans at this time is because this is the Prohibition era. So from 1920 to 1933, it is illegal to purchase alcohol, but of course we have the emergence of speakeasies where people are able to purchase bootleg alcohol and take part in other illicit activities, from gambling to interracial dancing or same-sex dancing. So the entertainment industry becomes a really important alternative for Black women who really didn't have many other opportunities for work.
Bentley first worked on the Harlem party circuit. Then a job opened up at a nightclub.
The club was actually looking for a male piano player, but she insisted that this would be the perfect time for them to start using a female instead.
My hands flew over the keys.
I'll make you men folk treat us women like you do. I don't want no man that I got to give my money to.
When I finished my number, the applause was terrific. I was offered work right on the spot.
Bentley soon became a headliner at various clubs and theaters.
We have clubs such as the Ubangi Club, where Gladys Bentley performed, which are appealing more to explicitly queer audiences. We have what's known as the pansy craze going on, this interest in queer culture that white people had in this period.
Gladys Bentley sometimes was billed as a male impersonator, showing queerness and flirting with women on stage and singing songs with lyrics that are upsetting all the cultural norms about identity.
That's a gorilla, a woman killer, and I ought to know.
Bentley's lyrics were known for their bold content, highlighting her cross-dressing tendencies and her feelings towards women.
She was not the only person who cross-dressed. Ethel Waters did it. Marlene Dietrich did it. Women, in their own ways, were challenging conceptions of what a woman could be.
So bad, pretty,
Gladys Bentley represents this.
So like I said, there's 7 more minutes if you want to watch it. It's really good. One of the rest of it is much more complicated. Her life is very complicated. And by the 1950s, this decade of possibility and visibility for queer people is over. By the 1950s, it's very much repressive culture. Things like the Lavender Scare, where over 1,000 federal employees were fired because they were known or suspected to be gay or lesbian. So by the 1950s, culture is so different. Gladys Bentley changes how she dresses, and she even writes an article in a Black magazine that I can't remember the name of, might be Jet, where she says that she went to a doctor who cured her. And now she's a normal woman. Very complex life. So you can investigate the rest of Gladys Bentley's life. And you know, we can't know what was in her mind and in her heart, but one of the cultural pressures that she's facing in the 50s is that there's no longer a space for a performer, the type of performer she was in the 20s. There's no nightclubs that will have her in the 1950s if she dresses like a man and presents herself as a lesbian so clearly. So this decade in the 1920s of relative visibility, this decade of spaces to, this decade of more tolerant spaces isn't the whole story, of course. And even in the 1920s and even in African-American communities, a lot of people spoke out against Gladys Bentley. And the 1920s are also marked by new ideas about race that are creating firmer racial identities, and marked by the American eugenics movement. So in that video of Gladys Bentley talking about ideas about homosexuality at this time and earlier, some of the little headlines they used were about forced sterilization. So one of the victims of the eugenics movement in the 1920s and forced sterilization is people who were not straight. So let's talk about eugenics and what it is. Let's get away from, there we go, because I want to talk about, yeah. Oh, also, sorry, I skipped this too. The Klan is back. The Klan is back and bigger in the 1920s. So the entire story of the 1920s isn't like, oh, look at this new acceptance for all kinds of people. That's not the whole story. Those are specific spaces where you can find that. But in the 1920s, the Klan is revived. And you can see that this new Klan, the second Klan, has now adopted those white hoods and burning crosses, which the director of Birth of a Nation invented for the Klan. That film, that really racist film about Reconstruction, which says the Klan is the heroes of Reconstruction, has actually, it's such a popular movie that it's created a resurgent interest in the Klan. And you can see that now they dress the way the Klan did in the film. And the second Klan is different in a couple of significant ways. First of all, the second Klan is still, the root of it is anti-Blackness. That's absolutely the root of the Klan. And in the South, of course, it's still that arm of terror upholding Jim Crow segregation. But around the country, this new Klan, still anti-Black. Also, they find new people to hate, including Jewish people, including Catholics, which might sound really odd, but the second Klan is anti-immigrant, and many Southern and Eastern European immigrants are Catholic, many Mexican-American immigrants are Catholic, so this anti-Catholicism is also part of their anti-immigrant stance. They're also anti-communist. This is the first Red Scare in the 1920s. Anti-communist and anti-feminist. They're opposed to not just the ideas of the new woman, but opposed to political feminism, including the right for women to vote. So this new Klan hates all kinds of people, and it's everywhere. It's not confined to the South. Now, it's still a tiny, tiny percentage of the population, right? This isn't like everyone, all the white Protestants become Klansmen is not the story here. But we see that the Klan pops up here, this image. They're in some sort of civic building, probably like a park house built by the Progressive era. They're like, thanks, we're gonna use it for our Klan meetings. This is in Seattle, Washington. So the Klan is no longer confined to the Jim Crow South. You find Klansmen and Klanswomen, because these men did not sew their own hoods. So you find Klansmen and Klanswomen all over the country in this time period. And they're part of, like I said, this firming the firming up of racial lines. And you see that in the 1924 Immigration Act as well, where in the 1920s, immigration policy is not based on labor needs, but is based on eugenics ideas of how to create a perfect population. So let me give you an example of what I mean. Like, what do you mean it's not based on labor needs? Labor needs are still taken into account. Of course, that doesn't go away entirely. And in fact, you can see that the 1924 Immigration Act doesn't restrict, for instance, immigration from the Western Hemisphere, from South and Central America, from Mexico. But it does restrict immigration from the whole continent of Africa and all of Asia. So a lot of this 1924 Immigration Act is aimed against especially Chinese. It's part of this Chinese exclusion of the time period. But the idea that immigration quota shouldn't be based on labor needs is new in the 20s. So you know that labor is always pro-immigration. That's how Homestead runs, through those constant waves of new immigrants. In the reflection on the illegal deportations, you're going to find that the business interests are saying, please stop deporting people. We need a growing workforce. The idea that labor and immigration are two separate issues is really new. Let me give you an example of President Coolidge's Secretary of Labor, a man named James Davis. He's the Secretary of Labor. His primary concern should be the needs of labor. One would hope the needs of workers, but his primary concern is probably the needs of business. But he says immigration has too long been concerned with the needs of labor. Instead, he says it should be based on, quotes, the quality of the immigrants and their fitness for democratic participation. So he says it should no longer be based on labor needs. It should no longer be based on an idea of America as an asylum to the world. He wants it to rest on a biological definition of race. And that's what the Immigration Act is doing. It says that some people just aren't as fit to be good democratic citizens as others. That is a eugenics idea, that you can create a perfect citizenry by filtering some people out. And you can see here that it's based in ideas about race. Now, this went all the way to the Supreme Court. So there was a Southeast Asian man. He was from India originally. He's a Sikh, and he was a World War I veteran. He had been living in America, and he wanted to become naturalized. And he wasn't able to, because he was originally from Southeast Asia. He was not able to become naturalized. And this went all the way to the Supreme Court. For some reason, I don't have the name of the Supreme Court case in front of me, but it's easy to find, I promise. And the Supreme Court essentially admits that the entire concept of race isn't scientific, because he went to the court and said, you say I'm not Caucasian, but to like badly paraphrase from The Office, like, where do you think the Caucasus Mountains are? He says, there's nothing about me that says I'm not Caucasian. The Supreme Court says, okay, yes, we get it that this isn't a very scientific or biological definition of race, but says that white is not a scientific concept, but, quote, part of the common speech to be interpreted with the understanding of the common man. I'm going to paraphrase that with another quote from the Supreme Court from the 70s. I can't define whiteness, but I know it when I see it. That's a paraphrase of the Supreme Court's definition of pornography. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. That's essentially what they say race is, whiteness is. Yeah, we get that there's no scientific definition of it, but we're looking at you and saying you are not white. So even though the Supreme Court admits, this isn't very firm, they uphold those limitations, and he is not able to become an American citizen. Like I said, this is rooted in eugenics. Eugenics literally translates from the Greek or the Latin. Someone might want to check me on that. I'm not actually sure, but it literally translates to well-born. And it's the idea that you can create a more perfect population, a more perfect citizenship by controlling who gets to have children. that basically some people shouldn't reproduce because their children aren't going to be a good part of this democratic population. Klaxons should be going off in your head based on that description. And in case you're already wondering, because students tend to ask pretty early, yes, the Nazis did use American ideas of eugenics in their own project of eugenics, which you know killed over 10 million people in their attempts to create a perfect race. American eugenics become popular in the 1920s. Now, America's not the only place that's practicing these ideas, experimenting with these ideas. And in many ways, it's connected to the progressive movement. This is, like I said, I got to be critical of things that I like. It's connected to progressive era ideas of state intervention. And it's maybe the darkest, or one of the darkest and one of the worst manifestations of that idea of government intervention, that it says that the government has a right to say who can and cannot have children. That's what's happening with the eugenics movement in the 1920s. The American eugenics movement largely takes place, like those unconstitutional deportations, largely this is happening on the state level. There isn't like a national eugenics program, but what you see instead is states undertaking this. And some of the worst offenders include California, Kansas, North Carolina, and Virginia. Those are just some of the worst states that practiced eugenics. And here you can see some of the images of eugenicists. Some people are born to be a burden on the rest. And this very obviously, if you've taken developmental psychology, if you're interested in human development, you know that this is none of this is scientific. You can't put people in categories of low imbecile, medium imbecile, high imbecile, moron, idiot. These are, I hope it's like super apparent to you that these categories are nonsense. And think about who would get put into these categories. You're talking about people who don't speak English well. You're talking about poor people who haven't had a lot of access to education. Or maybe people like in Appalachia, I taught y'all to say yins. That is a nonsensical word that doesn't exist anywhere else. Imagine a social worker from outside of Appalachia coming in, hearing the way that you talk in Appalachia and saying, I'm gonna grade you idiot for that. Non-neurotypical people who process information or express themselves differently could be put into this category. Other people too, though, we have at least evidence of at least one woman who was forcibly sterilized because she wore men's pants. She was forcibly sterilized because she wouldn't stop wearing men's pants. So there are all kinds of reasons that you could be marked as unfit and forcibly sterilized. Sterilized, in case you're not entirely sure, means that you're physically, through surgery or hormonally. There's a chemical castration for men, for instance. You're made so you can't have children. This also went to the Supreme Court. I'm just giving you a couple of terrible Supreme Court decisions, by the way. This one I do have the name of in front of me, 1927, Buck versus Bell. Here's what happened. Someone sued North Carolina to stop forcibly sterilizing people. The Supreme Court found, though, that sterilization laws were good for society and that they were constitutional if there was a process. So the Supreme Court says forced sterilization is constitutional as long as there is a process to decide who does and doesn't get sterilized. And here's how the process largely functioned on the ground. Let's imagine, I know I'm always sending us to Appalachia. Let's send ourselves to Appalachia once again. Imagine that you're a very poor woman. You don't have a lot of education. You do have a lot of children. You don't have access to birth control. You have a lot of children. And imagine that you see the social worker knocking on your door. Here again, I'm going to be critical of something that I love. I think social work is a very noble profession, but this is a very bad chapter in the history of social work. So let's imagine the social worker is knocking on your door. She's not from your community. She's not, if you're in the South or you're a Black Appalachian, she's probably white. She's way better educated than you. She might not share your language. She might not share your values. So she comes in and starts looking around. And she says, I see you have a lot of kids. Yeah, I have a lot of kids. She writes on her little notepad, sex maniac, right? She doesn't write, you don't have access to birth control. She doesn't write, that anything else. She says like, oh, you're probably a sex maniac. Let me put that down here. You might be wearing pants, which is going to get a big note in there. And then she says, do you have trouble taking care of all these kids? Yeah, I do. She says, well, I think you need a surgery. You need to go to the doctor. You don't have access to healthcare. So you're like, okay, yeah, I'll go to the doctor. Thank you. You go to the doctor puts you under, and you don't have any more children. You might not know why. So many victims of forced sterilization, some of them were children as young as 13 or 14, did not know they were sterilized until decades later when they tried to have children. But the process that a social worker came to your house, wrote down things that caught her eye that made you unfit, and then she went in front of the state sterilization board, and the sterilization board rubber stamped it. 95% of cases brought in front of the North Carolina Sterilization Board were given the yes for sterilization. 95% of the cases were approved. When you look at who was euthanized, you see a lot of very poor people, African Americans, Mexican Americans, Native Americans. You see people who were, like I said, non-neurotypical, not straight. All kinds of reasons could get you forcibly sterilized. This went into the 1970s. There are current lawsuits, like contemporary lawsuits about forced sterilization. And if you are interested in, is this still going on? You should check out sterilization that happens in prison populations. So there are arguments that the women who are sterilized while they are prisoners in state prisons, even if they sign a form that says they consent to this, there's some real ethical questions about whether or not a prisoner can actually consent to this type of surgery. So check that out. You're going to find a lot of prison activists are still talking about and concerned about forced sterilization. This lecture ends ugly. I'm sorry. It just ends really ugly. We're not even talking about that. That's in the lecture tomorrow. The economy is about to crash. So the 20s that we all think of, the flappers, the parties, the Great Gatsby, which also has a very dark ending. Those new spaces, new possibilities. At the same time and in the same country, we're seeing a growing limiting of possibilities as new ideas about race, really damaging ideas about race take hold, and as eugenics becomes more popular is not the word I'm looking for, as the American eugenics movement comes into its own. By the way, obviously by the end of World War II, when Nazis during their war crimes trials say, we base this on American eugenics, this is going to become absolutely toxic idea in America when Americans see what the logical end result of these ideas are with the murder of over 10 million people. So yeah, that's it. That's all I got for you. Let's talk briefly about, if you need to go, you can go. But if you want to get a little bit more